harsh language about the ongoing war in Gaza, which I myself would agree with. It's horrendous what's going on there. But the statement itself, if you read the whole statement, Starmer, Macron, they were calling for the dismantlement of Hamas from Gaza. They're calling for a two-state solution. Hamas does not want a two-state solution.
2 Israeli embassy staff were shot dead in Washington, D.C. last night. The UK signed a deal to hand the Chagos Islands over to Mauritius, which secures a military base there for £101 million a year. Campaigners there, who argue they're British citizens, took out an injunction earlier to stop the deal, which was then overturned by a High Court judge. Medications to be given out in 20 prisons to suppress sex offenders. It's part of a review designed to reduce overcrowding in jails in England and Wales. Chris Dorcasey, a criminal barrister at Millennium Chambers, told LBC this evening that it's absolutely ridiculous.
I've done a lot of research into this subject. I've travelled in the US and I've looked at states where they operate these kinds of things over there. The truth is that the drugs do work. They do massively reduce the propensity to offend in that particular cohort. But you can't force people to do it. And if they won't do it, then they have to stay in prison, don't they?
17 people have been assessed after a train crashed into a tractor and trailer on a level crossing in Herefordshire. It happened in Leominster. A 32-year-old man from Bromyard has been arrested on suspicion of endangering safety on the railway. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 47 points at 87.39. The pound buys $1.34 and €1.19. LBC weather, most places dry tonight with some clear spells. Mist in the south by dawn. Chilly with a low of 2 degrees. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8 on LBC. It's Iain Dale with you until 10. By the way, we are streaming this hour live, so if you'd like to watch our proceedings, you can do so on Global Player and the LBC app. Now, it's very rare nowadays that I find a new subject to talk about that I haven't covered over the last 15 years on the programme. But in this hour, we're going to do just that. In a way, I wish we didn't have to. But it's such an important subject, and so many women each year are subjected to the pain of birth trauma. And I don't mean sort of ordinary birth trauma, because I think anybody that I suspect, how can I say this? I'm a man. How would I know? But I suspect virtually no woman has a child without some degree of pain. Whether you can describe that as trauma, I don't know. But today we're going to talk to Theo Clarke, who's a former Conservative MP. She was MP for Stafford between 2019 and 2024. And she has written a book called Breaking the Taboo, Why We Need to Talk About Birth Trauma. And it's based on her own experience. She made a very moving speech in the House of Commons in, was it October 2023?
Yes, that's right.
And I think anybody that watched it, anybody that witnessed it, couldn't help but be moved by her experience. And she's sort of taken on the cause, really, as a champion for other women who've gone through the same experience. Theo, I don't know whether you, when you decided to make that speech, whether you intended it to have the impact that it had, but it certainly did have a big impact, didn't it?
Well, good evening, Ian, and thank you for having me on tonight's show. Well, you're absolutely right. First of all, I thought very long and hard about whether I should share my very personal experience of my traumatic birth, partly because it is such a personal story, but also because obviously my daughter, when she grows up, she will hear everything that I described about her and my experience. But I also thought it was incredibly important to speak about it because there does seem to be such a taboo in the UK around speaking about issues with childbirth. And I hope by me very publicly speaking about it in the chamber of the House of Commons that has helped other women to kind of feel less alone and that they don't need to have a stigma about it. And you mentioned there that I had a very emotional speech. Just for listeners to know, I actually burst into tears, which is obviously incredibly unusual for a sitting MP in the Chamber of Parliament. And at the time, I was actually very embarrassed, Ian. So I thought, crikey, I've just burst into tears in my place of work. How incredibly unprofessional. But I think it just shows how incredibly traumatised I still was after my experiences, which is what happened to my daughter when I gave birth, that even after so many months, it was so real and so painful to be talking about it so incredibly opening in the House of Commons.
When you were, I don't know how you give a speech, whether you sort of write it or whether you just stood up and sort of spoke from the heart. Well, it obviously was from the heart. But did you worry about breaking down?
To be honest, I hadn't really thought about it. I was so focused on reading so many stories because what happened a few months earlier is I decided to share my story for the first time. And I actually did an interview with a newspaper, and really overnight I was inundated with hundreds of families writing to me, sharing very similar stories, which are very distressing, ranging from maternal mental health to issues of birth injuries to examples of baby loss. And I was very conscious when I was writing my speech that it wasn't just about my experience, but I really wanted to become a kind of advocate for other women who didn't have the platform that I had then as a sitting member of Parliament. So I was so focused on kind of getting in the right statistics, on sharing things like PTSD affecting 30,000 women after birth, that I was really less focused on my own story. And I think it slightly sort of took me by surprise when it was very emotional to be in the chamber. And the House of Commons is a surprisingly intimate and small place to give a speech. And I think you really feel that kind of weight of history standing up, knowing you're live on television. And what you won't see in the clip when you watch it is actually in the gallery upstairs, I had about 30 mums who'd suffered from birth trauma who were watching my speech with my husband. And I really felt the kind of weight of expectations of them watching me and knowing that really for the first time birth trauma was being discussed. I find it astonishing that when I led my debate, it was the first in 1,000 years of our British Parliament on birth trauma. And I think it just needed to be told, to have that story and to have a greater focus on women's health, which I think has really been traditionally ignored in terms of policy.
Well, let's go back and talk about the birth, because I don't know how much detail we're going to go into, but I would encourage you to tell it from the heart as you experienced it, because there will be many mothers listening tonight who will have been through something either vaguely similar or very similar. And Theo will be taking calls after 8:30. So if you'd like to talk to her, maybe about your own experience, do feel free to give us a call, 0345 6060 973. So let's start with the pregnancy. Normal pregnancy?
Yes, very straightforward.
Was it your first?
It was my first and my only child. So very straightforward pregnancy, just the normal things like morning sickness. Although I always joke it's more like all day sickness because it's around the clock. And I think what was actually more difficult was less being pregnant, but more doing the job that I was doing. Because as you know, Iain, being an MP is an incredibly frenetic, busy job. It's really 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there's not much allowance made for a heavily pregnant mum. And, one example I can give you is, I remember we had a vote at sort of 1 a.m. on the police and crime bill. And I remember going into the whip's office at 10 o'clock to ask permission to go home. And I was vomiting so badly, I couldn't actually go into the division lobby to even cast my vote. And I had to lie down on a bed sort of nearby in Parliament. And the whip's office said, you can't go home. You've got to be here to vote with the government. And I think we won the vote by over 40. So they could have definitely sent me home. So I think there's a lot of allowances not made for MPs. And it's a very unusual workplace to obviously be pregnant. But I'd say a very straightforward pregnancy. The only thing that was different for me was that I have a very significant phobia of needles and of blood. Not something I spoke about to other colleagues and MPs. But that did make me quite fearful in advance about being in hospital. I hadn't spent a great deal of time in hospital. I've not had a large history of illness that's required any stays. So for me, it was, quite frightening to think about giving birth and knowing that if a medical intervention happened, that it was probably going to cause me quite a lot of distress.
So, I don't know if there were any events during the pregnancy that are relevant here, but take us up to the day that you had your child. Well,
firstly, the first couple of weeks of my last trimester was an incredibly stressful time because, as you know, Iain, there is literally never a day off as a sitting MP. And I had firstly an extraordinary moment when I had to resign from Boris Johnson's government as I was sat in the maternity assessment unit in the hospital in Royal Stoke. And actually my daughter's heartbeat had started skipping a beat, and I was rushed into the hospital and told I might have to have an emergency caesarean. And I remember being in the queue waiting to see the consultant at the MAU, and I was literally typing out my letter of resignation to the Prime Minister saying that I needed to have a vote of confidence in the government. And the whole time I was so worried about my baby. So that was quite a stressful kind of final trimester leading up to the birth. But my daughter didn't arrive by my due date, which was on my birthday. And I had attended antenatal classes for several weeks before the birth. And to be honest, there had been such a focus on how to look after a newborn baby, things like sleep routines, how to feed your baby. But there was very little talked about when things go wrong. And I was induced because my daughter didn't arrive by her due date. And I spent basically 2 weeks waiting for her to arrive. And I remember calling the hospital repeatedly to say, I need to come in and have my baby. As we all know, the risks hugely increase past your due date. And I found it quite shocking that the hospital basically just didn't call me, and I'd call them every hour to try and get booked in. And when I did eventually get to the hospital, I basically spent 40 hours in labour. And induction, as many mums will know, is a very gruelling process. So it's basically trying to force your body into labour.
And just before we go into the details of that, I find they must have known you were the local MP. And I'm thinking, well, if you couldn't get in as the local MP, what chance Mrs. Miggins from 32 Acacia Avenue?
Absolutely. And the only reason I got booked in the end was because I'd had this phobia issue. I'd been referred to a specialist mental health service before the birth. And that meant that I had what's called a PMA, which is a mental health advocate, who was a named individual with a real telephone number that I could call. Whereas obviously most mums wouldn't have that because they don't have a specialist service. And I remember being in induction, and it was, first of all, very strange experience because you're in a shared bay with other mothers also giving birth at the same time as you. And basically they try and force your body into going into labour. So I'd have these incredibly invasive vaginal examinations every few hours. I'd be pumped full of drugs to try and stimulate labour. And it got to the point where really nothing was happening. I kept being told, you failed to progress, and all the language was incredibly negative, which I found very surprising because giving birth is not an exam. There's no pass or fail. And they ended up having to break my waters. And it became very clear that my daughter just didn't want to come out. And they had to put me on what's called an oxytocin drip. And for any mum who's had that, they'll know it hugely ramps up your contractions. So it's much more aggressive and dynamic than you would probably have if you'd gone so spontaneously into labour. And bearing in mind that process took 40 hours.
Can I ask a bloke question now?
Of course.
Why not just have a caesarean?
So because I had such a phobia of needles and blood, I knew that to have a caesarean, you basically have to have an IV and a drip in your hand to be in a theatre to keep you stable. And I'd also been told, the whole way through my antenatal classes that you could have a natural birth. I'd been led to think with my birth plan that I could have a water birth in the midwife-led unit. And I really was not prepared for this very medical environment that I was put in. And I don't think we really talk much about induction to mothers at all. But actually the rates have hugely increased. And I remember I finally had the oxytocin drip put in, which massively increased contractions. And I was so exhausted. I've been awake now for 40 hours, trying to desperately sleep. But then the contractions were so painful. I think the best way I can describe it, it was almost like having a tube door sort of being repeatedly closed on your stomach. That's what it felt like. And I remember going to sleep for a few hours after the pain relief was given to me. And I woke up and was told, the baby's about to come, you need to start pushing. And it was absolute agony. I've never been in such excruciating pain. And I finally pushed my daughter out, held her very briefly, and then basically started hemorrhaging. And I started bleeding very heavily. The room suddenly rushed full of doctors and nurses coming in to see me. I got taken into the emergency theatre. And what had happened is I'd suffered what I now know was a very serious birth injury called a third-degree tear. But I didn't know this at the time. I was just separated from my daughter. And I'll be honest, it was a very terrifying experience. I was taken down in a trolley down the hospital corridor. And I remember it bumping into the walls. I remember being slid onto the operating table. And then I was operated on for over 2 hours and I was awake in surgery. So they refused to give me a general anaesthetic because of the fact I'd had an earlier epidural. And I was so distressed, I asked for my husband to come in with me, which is very unusual for a major operation. And thank God he did. I mean, I think I would have had a heart attack on the operating table. I was so distressed and I was basically stitched up. Yeah, and also it's just very frightening, for a normal member of the public like me who's not spent much time in any kind of medical environment. It feels a bit like being in a war zone. I mean, you're basically bleeding out, lying on a table, being operated on. You think you're going to die. And, there was one moment I genuinely felt I was going to die. I thought my husband would be a single dad and I thought I'd never see my daughter again. And that was absolutely terrifying. And that's why, the trauma has been in my body for so many years afterwards, because just trying to process that experience is incredibly difficult.
I think we'll go to a break now and then talk about the aftermath and why you've become so public about this and really a real campaigner on it. And also, don't forget, if you want to talk to Theo maybe about your experience, the number to call 0345 6060 973. It's 16 minutes past 8.
LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
18 minutes past 8. Theo Clarke is here talking about her book, Breaking the Taboo, all about birth trauma. You've also got a podcast.
I do, also called Breaking the Taboo. And the reason I set it up, Ian, was because once I gave my speech in Parliament, so many families started writing to me, firstly sharing their stories, but also asking me to signpost them to help. And I'm very conscious now, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a midwife, but a lot of people have seen my speech and campaign. So the podcast was really to sort of help affected families to find access to help. So we get on specialists, NHS professionals, so that mums can get help.
Andrew is making a reference to a comment I made earlier about the fact that if they must have known you were an MP, and he's saying, does Ian think MPs should get preferential treatment? No, I don't think MPs should get preferential treatment. But if they know that the patient is an MP, I mean, human nature means that they would normally sort of probably go out of their way to make sure the MP had a good experience. And if people in the public eye don't get good services, whether it's in the health service or wherever, then you have to wonder what the ordinary members of the public are going to experience when they go into it. That's the only point I was trying to make, obviously clumsily.
But actually, to be fair, I don't think they did know, Ian. So my hospital, I wasn't able to give birth in Stafford because the midwifery birthing unit was shut. So I had to go to the adjacent constituency in Stoke-on-Trent. So to be honest, I think most people had absolutely no idea I was a sitting politician, which is probably a good thing.
Well, let's go back to the immediate aftermath of having the operation. I mean, the recovery period must have been quite long.
It was very lengthy. And the first thing to say is, being in hospital, I was there for nearly a week trying to recover. And a couple of things sort of happened which really opened my eyes to kind of the lack of postnatal care in the country. The first was when I was brought into the recovery ward after surgery. First, I was separated from my daughter for several hours, and no one actually took the time in to tell me how she was, where she was. I actually thought my daughter had died because no one had taken the time to bring her in to see me, and that was very distressing. But secondly, I remember coming out, and there was one moment when I think my husband must have popped out to get some food, and I was on my own. And you have to bear in mind, I was completely basically paralysed from the waist down from the epidural. I couldn't sit up. I couldn't hold my baby. I had, a drip attached to me with an IV line. I had a catheter in. I was really in no fit state to do anything. And I remember pressing the emergency button to ask for help. And this NHS member on the ward that night literally came in, looked at me and said, "Not my baby, not my problem," and just walked out and left me there with my baby screaming in the cot next to me. And I'll never forget it. I actually had to make a complaint to the hospital because I have never been more vulnerable in that particular moment. And that was the moment I needed the most compassionate care, and I didn't get it. So that was really the start of a very difficult recovery time. And you have to remember that post having a birth injury, I had major issues going to the toilet. I basically had to be carried by my husband to the loo. I was bleeding very heavily for weeks and weeks after delivery. I couldn't walk up the stairs. I couldn't sit in a car. And this was all coinciding with, being an MP, which is very difficult. I mean, in the first week I was in hospital, I was already receiving complaints of you had your baby, quote, a whole week ago. Why can't we see you for a face-to-face surgery appointment? And I couldn't even leave bed, Ian, let alone see a member of my family, hadn't seen my in-laws, let alone a member of the public. And it really took, weeks and weeks of very specialist recovery with firstly a birth injury specialist clinic at Royal Stoke Hospital, but also help with the PTSD from birth. And I mentioned that around 30,000 women every year are suffering from a traumatic birth and going on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And I had to have mental health support for that as well, and to have therapy for many months after the birth.
How does that manifest itself?
So in my case, it was, first of all, incredible hyperanxiety. So you basically think your baby's going to die because you've been separated from her, and it's obviously a real trigger. So I'll give you an example. I remember the first time I basically left the house and went to see any friends just in the pub, a few miles down the road from my home in Stafford. And I literally pulled the car over every single mile, absolutely convinced that my daughter had stopped breathing because I couldn't see her in the car seat behind me. And of course, she was absolutely fine. She was just sat looking out the window. But you just have that incredible hypervigilance and anxiety that you're so traumatized, you think something's happened. And just things like intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, and being very triggered. So I remember the first time I went back to the hospital where I'd obviously had given birth, and I basically just burst straight into tears walking into the doors. And things like medical appointments for a cervical smear checkup, I just didn't want to go because I felt so stressed about being back in any kind of medical context. So it's really taken a long time to get to the point that, A, I'm able to talk about it now very publicly, but also to be able to go back into a medical setting, which I found very stressful.
And what about going back to Parliament?
Well, firstly, Parliament is really not set up as a modern day workplace. I mean, I think one of my reflections was there are a few things which were brought in the last few years which have made a difference. And the first I'll acknowledge is the proxy vote. So the Speaker did give me the ability for 6 months to vote, basically with a colleague voting on my behalf. And that made a huge difference because I didn't have to obviously go with my baby every couple of days down to vote in London. But to be honest, they just really hadn't thought about anything else. I mean, I remember during the pandemic, we were able to obviously vote remotely. We had electronic questions in the chamber. I could basically dial in and ask a sort of Prime Minister's question directly to the Prime Minister. And I found it rather astonishing that we had all of that technology during COVID-19. And then when I would have loved to have asked a question in a major debate on something like HS2, which directly affected Stafford, I was basically told you have to come on the 4-hour commute down to Parliament to speak and your proxy vote will be cancelled. So they hadn't really thought through how Parliament should work for basically babies in Parliament and mums who've had very difficult experiences. And I remember talking about this to Tracy Crouch when she had cancer, and she had a different but similar experience where she basically felt that for women who were very ill, there wasn't a proper system set up to support those of us that had significant health challenges. And I have written a whole chapter about modernising Parliament, because I do feel that it's not a fit for purpose 21st century workplace. And I do find it quite ironic, to be honest, that we were legislators, and I'd vote on laws that would make, businesses more family friendly. And none of those were applicable to us in our own place of work, which I think that they really need to change, because there's also an impact on democracy, because if you don't make it family friendly, you're not going to have women standing for public office who are going to have young children. And that will also impact on policy, because then they won't be discussing women's health, birth trauma, all the things that I was talking about as a young mum and having a baby in Parliament.
I was thinking about how I asked this question, but somebody's sent in a text, so I'm just going to read out the text. Yeah. Can you ask the lady if she's planning on having another baby?
The honest answer is no. And I can say honestly, that's because my experience was so traumatic the first time around. I honestly couldn't go through it again. And I do feel a lot of guilt as a mum that I'm not going to have a sibling for my daughter. But I also know that I'm not alone in that experience. I mean, I did a survey with Mumsnet last year, and we asked a very similar question to their mums. And 76% of them said that they wouldn't have another child because they'd suffered birth trauma. So this has a much wider impact on the British economy, and it has a wider impact on women going back to work and many other things. But I also hope that by me signposting mums to resources out there, I've decided not to extend my family. But I do hope that other women, if they do get support with their mental and physical recovery post-birth, feel that they can extend their family. And I think part of the point of breaking the taboo is to let them, ask for help and to feel that they can talk about it.
Let's talk about your husband, because this was a hugely traumatic episode for you, but it will have been for him as well. How's he coped with it?
Well, my husband actually wrote his story down for the very first time in my book for exactly that point, that I don't think dads are asked enough. But I was really surprised that when I chaired the birth trauma inquiry in Parliament last year, it wasn't just mothers writing to us, but also quite a large number of fathers too. And they obviously felt extremely distressed because they had witnessed a very traumatic birth.
And helpless, I imagine.
Very helpless. And they had, really bad experiences. Some fathers said to me they were never spoken to during the entire labour, completely dismissed and ignored by staff. Another dad told me he was basically, the only time he was spoken to was to ask, would you like to save your wife or your child? Oh. And they didn't even speak to him by his name. And, a lot of them have gone on to develop PTSD. And my husband was very significantly impacted by the whole experience of, seeing me bleed out, thinking I was going to die. He writes in the book, he thought he was going to be a single dad. And that was a very, very frightening experience. And I don't think we give enough airtime to dads to talk about their experiences too.
I've been in hospital several times over the past few years. Obviously, nothing as traumatic as you went through. But the whole time I was thinking, well, these people know what they're doing. They're professionals. I don't need to worry. I think a lot of people get very anxious about having a general anaesthetic. And I just thought, well, they do this all the time. And so why should I worry? But when you're in that situation like you were, and where your trust in things must have been damaged even before the birth, I mean, that must have had a huge impact on you.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think the other thing is just the lack of continuity of care. So when someone like my mum gave birth, 40 years ago, she would have basically had the same midwife during her pregnancy. They were likely on call in the hospital for when you went into labour, and you probably see them for a checkup appointment at home in the few weeks afterwards. And unfortunately, that's really not how the NHS is set up today. And, I was in hospital for many days, and every 12 hours, the shift is changing. So you basically have new staff coming in who don't know what's happened to you. And I gave one a story in the book of just people not even doing basic things like reading notes. So I remember when I came out of theatre, the lady just basically said, "Oh, well, you've had a C-section." And I remember just screaming at her saying, "Read your notes. I have not had a cesarean." Like, what a basic thing to get wrong. And that's partly what led me on the path to campaigning for change. Was I just really saw this catalogue of failures within the NHS, and then discovered that I was not alone, and that my experience, unfortunately, is symptomatic of a wider issue across the UK, which that there is a postcode lottery of maternity care, and that postnatal care in this country is not, frankly, good enough.
Right, in a moment it's time to take some phone calls, 0345 6060 973. You can feel free to ask Theo a question about her experiences, maybe a question that I haven't thought to ask, because I always feel as a man interviewing a woman in a situation like this, there's bound to be questions that I haven't thought of, so I'm sure my listeners will come up with ones that I should have asked but haven't. And also, feel free to tell us about your experiences as well. It's 8:30 on LBC. Daryl Jackson has news headlines.
Israel's Prime Minister's accused Sir Keir Starmer of being on the wrong side of history on the conflict in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu has also attacked his Canadian counterpart as well as the French president. They'd released a statement calling for a ceasefire and an aid blockade to be lifted. The Justice Secretary's told LBC she has no moral objections to making chemical castration for sex offenders compulsory. Shabana Mahmood has expanded voluntary pilot schemes to 20 prisons. And a rail passenger has been airlifted to hospital after the train he was on hit a tractor on a level crossing. It happened near Leominster in Herefordshire on the Transport for Wales Manchester to Cardiff line. LBC weather, most places dry tonight with clear spells, mist in the south by dawn, chilly with a low of 2 degrees.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:33 on LBC. Theo Clarke is here, former Conservative MP for Stafford. She's talking about her book, Breaking the Taboo. It's an interesting title because there aren't many taboos left that we don't talk about, but this is certainly one of them. It's all about Theo's experience of a very traumatic birth. She's been campaigning on the issue ever since. You chaired an inquiry, I think, as well, in the Commons on this. Has there been... I mean, how does the NHS react to this sort of the criticism that you make? Because generally it's sort of, well, let's batten down the hatches, it'll all go away soon. Has there been any meaningful change?
Well, it was firstly a huge effort to try and get the NHS and the government to make a change to improve postnatal care for mums. What ended up happening was after I gave my speech, I set up this new all-party parliamentary group in Parliament, which was cross-party with MPs from all political parties, with the then Labour MP Rosie Duffield. And we started to receive evidence from other families, and we decided to launch this cross-party birth trauma inquiry because, back to your point, Iain, the only way to effect change is to firstly hear from as many families as possible to know what the issues are so that you can then get the NHS to address them. But let's be honest, also to try and get the government's attention. And, you know, they cannot ignore over 1,300 families which wrote to myself and Rosie with some really shocking and devastated testimony. I mean, we heard about babies with brain brain injuries, about babies that had died. We heard about babies who've been starved of oxygen at birth due to medical negligence. We heard about birth injuries, people who'd suffered PTSD. I mean, the list and catalogue of errors of things that had gone wrong in their care really couldn't be ignored. And so I spent basically several months chairing these evidence inquiry sessions in Parliament to hear directly from the families. And it culminated in this large report, which was published a year ago. And we came out with a set of over 40 recommendations to the Prime Minister. And we did persuade Rishi Sunak to do something about it. So he announced in the House of Commons, in response to my question at Prime Minister's questions, that there would finally be a standardised maternity policy, because there wasn't one. And we asked for a national maternity improvement strategy. And he had stood up and agreed to that. And 1 week later, can you imagine, they called the general election. And I suppose what I find deeply disappointing is that, the government have now been in power for 10 months and we haven't had the same level of commitment. So the fact the previous government had accepted quite a number of the recommendations of this cross-party report, and they've not actually been enacted by the new government. So I continue to have to call on the Health Secretary to say, yet more families have come forward with very devastating stories, as I've outlined in my book. And I don't understand why the government is not taking action to address it, because clearly the situation is getting worse, not better. And I think the government needs to improve maternity care.
Right, let's go to the calls. Rachel's in Newport in South Wales. Rachel, very good evening. What would you like to say?
Good evening, Ian. Good evening to you. I'm just in shock listening to this, because I was listening to, it's brought a lot of memories back for me. I had my son in October 1993, and I went through very similar to what Theo went through. And he's almost 32 years of age now, and I can't believe this is still going on. And I still suffer with PTSD now.
What, from the point of view of when, you hear this on the radio and it brings it all back to you, and therefore immediately you recall the trauma, the pain and everything?
Yeah. It's just incredible listening to her, how similar. And the thing is, at the time, although I'm in South Wales, there was no devolution back then. So I think the NHS was just one unit. But it's so incredibly similar to what she went through. I ended up having to have 5 pints of blood afterwards. And my son was up on special baby care, £10.06 1/4. And he was very jaundiced. He looked like a banana. And listening to her, it was almost like a mirror image, a mirrored story of what I went through. I really can't believe that nearly 32 years on, that women are still struggling like this. I can't help thinking that it's trying to save money.
Well, Rachel, firstly, I'm so sorry to hear about your experience, and I think to know that you're not alone, I know has helped a lot of other mums who've written into me. And I think it is absolutely shocking. I mean, we heard from so many mums like yourself who wrote into me last year who'd not just given birth in the last few weeks or months, but in the last decades. And they had very similar experiences, but also they felt like they hadn't been able to talk about it. And I'm interested to know if you did get support for your PTSD, because obviously maternal mental health services are not universal across the UK, certainly not in Wales. And that's something
it's appalling.
And that's something I've been calling on the government to do is to end that postcode lottery, because I think it's outrageous, quite frankly, that, mums will be offered some services in parts of the UK that they're not offered in others. And every mum who's had an experience like yours should be being offered specialist mental health services. So I'm so sorry to hear about your experience, and I hope that you did get some help.
And I just want to say thank you to you for what you're doing in campaigning, because it could continue to happen if we don't do something about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for phoning in. You're launching this campaign, you got your podcast, you did the inquiry. Do you feel that this issue will continue to dominate your life? And do you have to sort of almost compartmentalise the campaigning side? So, and doing a programme like this, obviously brings it all back to you. How do you compute that?
Well, I think firstly, you're right in that I think I'm going to be campaigning on this for life. I mean, it's become part of my story. And I think all of my friends, when I got elected, assumed that my interest was kind of foreign policy and trade and international affairs. And I certainly did not expect to become a kind of well-known champion about maternity care in the NHS. But I feel like my story did go viral and it did become such a platform for other women that I feel a real responsibility now to keep up that campaign. And that's also partly why I'm setting up this new charity called the Global Birth Trauma Alliance, because I think as politicians, they should be advocating more for better maternity care. And I find it really shocking to read, in the recent news that the government has just cut the maternity safety budget from being ring-fenced from 95 million to 2 million. And that was money which was given to maternity in the wake of the terrible and avoidable baby deaths from the Ockenden Review. And I just think it's frankly shocking that the government has reduced that budget. So it just makes the point that people like myself and other campaigners have got to keep making the argument to government to say, you've got to prioritise maternity, you've got to fund it. We need to have more midwives, anaesthetists, obstetricians on the ward. When I gave birth, it was a very busy weekend and a bank holiday in August, and they were clearly understaffed, and the government needs to invest more in frontline maternity care.
James is a new caller in Shropshire. Hello, James.
Hi, Ian. Nice to speak to you.
What would you like to say?
I just want to say thank you to the caller. From a dad's perspective, very similar experience. 3 years ago, my wife went into heart failure, had a baby 8 weeks early, had the baby 8 weeks early. And I always remember that evening kind of sitting in a doctor's waiting room while my wife was on the operating table, not knowing what was going on. Weirdly watching Willow on the TV with another doctor sitting there drinking his coffee, and then being whisked to see the baby and not seeing my wife, running across from the heart section of the hospital to the neonates, and then an hour later a doctor walking in and kind of saying to me, well, your wife died on the operating table, but we got back, and then walking out, and then being asked to leave the room while I had to do some emergency procedure on my daughter. And, that trauma, my wife obviously suffered it much worse, but it broke me. I did the man thing of sitting there and thinking, am I coming home alone? Am I coming home with my wife? Am I coming home with a daughter? Putting everything into a box and locking the box because I've got a son at the time, and thinking, well, I've got to be strong for my son. So I've got to carry on whatever happens. And I ended up with, much like your husband, PTSD that manifested in being emotionless. I had no concept of emotions, fear, happiness, joy. I remember holding the baby and looking at my daughter, thinking, I know I should love you, but, I just don't feel that warm, fuzzy feeling. Holding a bottle of bleach and thinking, I wonder what this tastes like. I know I shouldn't drink it because it would kill me, but not having the fear that, is inherent in that. And thankfully that support in Shropshire is good, and both my wife and me got that mental health support. But the care for my wife in the hospital, after the operation was awful. Much like yourself, because she's had a C-section, they left her on a bed, they put the buzzer nowhere near her, to the point where she had to call me at home to call the hospital to get a nurse to go in and give the buzzer.
Gosh.
How long ago was this, James?
3 years.
3 years.
Yeah.
And I can hear in your voice, obviously it's still affecting you.
It's actually that I was listening and it just kind of, hit a heartstring. I suppose it's guilt. I do feel guilty about this kind of 6 months not in myself and that time shooting looking the baby. I know in my mind, logically, I was there and I was okay. It's just, it really impacted me. So I thought I'd have to call and just say thank you.
Well, thank you for calling, because this is not an easy issue to talk about in public. Theo has said for her, she never expected to have to do this. And I think also, calling a radio station to talk about this, it's not a natural thing to do in many ways. But it's important that you have, James, and indeed to Rachel. Hannah says, thank you so much for shining a light on this area. I found giving birth the first time, which included induction, tear and epidural I think that must be a type. Epidural suturing, is that a word?
Suturing.
Suturing, I've no idea. Afterwards, and then continual bleeding for 13 weeks, after which I had to go back for an operation to have products from conception removed. So traumatic that I couldn't bring myself to have a second child, even though I desperately wanted one. I was offered something called Reflections at my local hospital, where my midwife and I went through my notes step by step. This reduced the trauma as I recognised how well it was all managed. I also had CBT support from local mental health support offered by NHS for prenatal mothers. I was so fortunate, and I went on to have a second beautiful baby. That's Hannah in Scunthorpe.
Wow. Well, thank you to both of the previous listeners for sharing your experience, because I know, having done it myself, how difficult it is to talk about this. And firstly, Hannah, I'm interested to hear that you also had a birth reflection service, because I did have one as well. And for listeners who've not heard of that, it's when you're basically invited to go back to the hospital, and they go through and they discuss your birth, and they go through the notes and in your timeline, and it helps you to kind of better understand what happened to you. But I was very shocked to describe that that's actually not offered in every hospital trust. So it's not a national service. And that's something that I continue to campaign for, is that I really think that every mum should be offered that, Iain, to have a kind of safe space post-birth to talk about it, to help them to process what's happened.
Was it going back to that same hospital?
Well, I did mine on the telephone, and I think you make an important point that it can be very traumatising and triggering to go back. But I think when you are ready to go through your notes, I think it's quite important to help you to process and to understand what's happened to you. But as I said, it's so fragmented, NHS care. I find it just appalling that you're basically not offered the same level of care in every part of the country. It is not a standardised maternity care policy in the UK, and that's why I've been campaigning to make that the case.
Well, there's always one who sends in a horrible text, so let's have that one, shall we, just for a bit of balance. The irony of Iain Dale, a flag-waving Tory, interviewing an ex-Tory MP about lack of funding to NHS services is beyond laughable. Theo, maybe look at your time in Parliament and at the party you were elected to represent and reflect, rather than this pitiful self-promotion dressed up as moral mission.
Well, everyone's entitled to their view. I think the first thing I'd say is I don't think that's a fair criticism of the last Conservative government. I mean, they did pump in a huge amount of extra resources into maternity in particular, and also into the NHS. So I take the caller's point, but I think we also need to look at the data and the facts, which is that there was a significant increase in the NHS budget under the last government, and that is the case. The fact that it's not enough is a different point. And, I think it's fair to say that this government hasn't done a particularly good job either. I mean, I mentioned earlier how they've cut this ring-fenced maternity safety budget. And the Royal College of Midwives has said that we need to recruit around another 2,000 midwives to be at the sort of full levels of staffing to be safe in our hospitals. So the government needs to find the money to do that so that we have safer levels of maternity care. And I will continue to call on the government to fund maternity care better, because quite frankly, it's not fit for purpose as it currently is.
Right, we'll take more of your calls in just a moment. It's 8:48 here on LBC.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
It's time for LBC to do what it does best, which is not just to cover the story, but to try and get to the people at the very heart of the story. And this justice sentencing has been making headlines. So, welcome, David Gauke. You've chaired the Ministry of Justice Sentencing Review. You rightly referenced that a lot of petty crime is sometimes fueled by addiction to alcohol or on drugs. Is there ever an idea that you would look at people taking drugs that would actually stop their intake of alcohol?
Yes, some of the weight loss drugs may well be effective in terms of reducing desire to consume a lot of alcohol.
This drug does everything.
It doesn't feel like that, yeah.
It's ceaseless, this drug. My goodness.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio, on Global Player, and the new LBC app. Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:51. Theo Clarke is here talking about her book, Breaking the Taboo, Why We Need to Talk About Birth Trauma. Interesting, we have lots of men phoning in.
Oh.
I wasn't necessarily expecting. Kevin is in Lee-on-Sea in God's Own County of Essex. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Ian. How are you?
Good, thank you. What would you like to say?
Well, yeah, nice to speak to you again. And thank you, Theo, for writing this book and for raising this issue. Yes, I'm going to come at this from a man's perspective, but just very briefly. So my wife gave birth to our first child 21 years ago, went through a very similar birthing trauma experience where the labour itself was 30 hours. And then when my wife eventually gave birth, she had to have 51 internal stitches that were delivered in the birthing room, not in the operating theatre. Now, whether that was because the theatre was busy, but the surgeon came in to do the surgery in the delivery room. And from a male perspective, and I think the point that Theo raised is very good. As a man, well, and you raised the point as well, Ian. As a man, you walk in there expecting everybody knows what they're doing. And I really don't want it to sound like it's a criticism of the people in the frontline health service, because it absolutely isn't. They do the best that they can do. But as a man, as a father, our first child, we have no manual, we have no books. We was rarely involved in the prenatal part of the birth, so we have absolutely no idea what to expect. So when you go into this life-changing moment as a man, and you witness what you witness, and you assume the people around you are going to do everything they can in the best professional way. And again, I don't want it to sound like I'm criticising, I'm not, but for us, had I had more information prenatal, then perhaps I could have intervened earlier, because my wife tells me many years afterwards, I said, well, why didn't you and I was present at the birth, and I think every father, by the way, should be present at the birth, so I was absolutely present at the birth, so I witnessed all of this. But at some point during that 30-hour labour, my wife was offered a C-section, but she declined because she said she was adamant she wanted a natural birth. But I could have probably intervened at some point and said, you know what, we need to, not override her wishes, but we've got to the point where the baby is now in trauma, my wife is now in trauma, and we just need to go for the C-section. And possibly all of that additional trauma afterwards could have been avoided. So given that, we seem to have made some minor progress, because at least Theo was given the opportunity to go to surgery to have the major trauma taken care of to some degree. But why is it when we are continuing to pump more and more and more money into the NHS that all of that money doesn't seem to be solving the frontline clinical outcomes, and particularly in maternity care? And really, what is the solution? What actually is the solution? Because just pumping more money into it doesn't seem to be changing it.
Well, I think that's an entirely fair point.
Well, such a good point, Kevin, and thank you for sharing your experience as a dad. So I think you're right. Money is only part of the solution. I think it's also about policy and training within the NHS. And something that really struck me was how, antenatal classes are not something that's mandatory and offered across the UK. I mean, I had to pay to go to classes with NCT, and I mainly did it to just meet other mums who were kind of living near me and were having due date at a similar time to myself. But there was really no point where they kind of discussed risks in childbirth. And I remember during the birth trauma inquiry, we had a Dutch doctor who gave evidence from the Netherlands. And he said that in their care pathway, at the week 34 appointment with your midwife, they would sit down with you and they would discuss, these are all the things that might go wrong. What would you like to happen in that scenario? And I find it interesting that we don't have an equivalent moment in the UK within the NHS. So I think it's partly about training, but it's also about better educating the public about their rights. And you're so right, Kevin, about being an advocate for your partner, because, I found when I was in labour, it was very difficult to advocate for myself, and my husband became a very important person, making those comments on my behalf. So I think it's really important that we do listen to the dads, because they know their partner the best, particularly when we can't advocate for ourselves.
Kevin, thank you very much indeed. Right, let's go to Etty in Kentish Town. Etty, good evening. What would you like to say?
Hi. First, I'd just like to say thank you so much, dear, for all of the work you've done. I think it's amazing. And I suppose it's really a very similar point to what Kevin just said. How much do you think the problems with maternity provision are due to underfunding? And how much do you think it is because of the sort of either lack of training or a difficult attitude that people have towards women where they're not taken seriously enough and they're not listened to, which is, I know, one of the things that came out of the Ockenden review. And yeah, do you know that, having sort of been in Parliament and the work you've done since?
Well, thank you, Etty, for calling in with your question. So, yes, I agree, firstly, that there is partly a problem with underfunding, which I talked about earlier. But I think you're right. We also need to have quite a frank conversation, to be honest, within the NHS about culture. I mean, I heard some really shocking examples, Iain, of mums not being listened to. And some of these things don't require extra funding. They're actually just about compassion and training. So to give you some examples, mums saying they were brought a glass of water and it was put 6 metres away on the other side of the room when they've just had a caesarean section and they can't move. Or, for example, being told to go and get their food down the hall when they've just come out of surgery and they can't walk. Or not being asked, are they okay? These are things that actually don't require additional government funding. They're about training and compassion. And maybe we've almost gone too far towards the kind of medical aspect of birth that we've kind of lost some of the empathy. And, if someone had just come in and held my hand and said, Theo, are you okay? Or it's going to be all right. We know from the data that actually reduces your birth trauma. So I've been making this argument to the NHS leadership that, compassion is free and it needs to be part of their training.
OK, Etty, thank you. Now, we've just got time to squeeze in Maggie in Leeds, but we haven't got a lot of time, Maggie. If you can be brief, I'd be grateful. Sorry.
Right, hello. Thank you so much for highlighting this situation once again. I'm a retired midwife, qualified in 1989 and retired in 19. I still work within the maternity services of healthcare. I can't implore enough how much this needs to be just discussed. I work with loads of amazing midwives. We have an amazing unit. The women are complicated now compared to what they used to be. Our numbers are being cut. When I hear what you're just saying, it makes me cry. I'm crying. I'm working tomorrow and I'm working all over the bank holiday weekend. It makes me sad to think that we're putting a glass of water too far away from a woman. I had a student midwife the other day ask me to teach her how to make a bed with hospital corners. They're not taught that in uni. There's too much uni. There's not enough time on the ward being taught compassion and care and smiling at the women, communicating, just listening to them.
But does that have to be taught?
Well, it does, Iain, it does. Yes, it does. And it's not instinctive to some people. I know, it's frightening, isn't it? But I always, when I mentored students, the first thing I said was your greatest skill is communicating, how you communicate. You walk into a delivery room, you smile at the partner. You do have to teach some of these young girls how to communicate, how to be compassionate. It makes me so sad. Honestly, please keep doing the work that you're doing. I'm sorry, I only got halfway through the conversation. I've been busy. I can't remember your name, but please.
It's Theo, and you can go back on catch up and listen to the first half as well.
I'm going to.
Thank you,
so
Maggie.
much.
Thank you. Briefly, if you can, Theo.
Well, thank you, Maggie. And I totally agree with everything you just said. I mean, I went recently to speak at Staffordshire University to meet with some of their student midwives. And to be honest, they were actually very interested in the birth trauma inquiry's recommendations, and they wanted to be the next generation to improve the care. And they were really interested to hear that all those really basic things like asking, is mum okay, bringing us food, helping us to breastfeed, some of the stuff that might seem quite basic actually, but is really what can make the difference to your stay in hospital being a good experience or a bad experience. But I also think we really need to look at policy change. I mean, things like birth injuries is a really good example. When I gave birth, only 17 hospital trusts in the UK had training on birth injuries. Isn't that crazy, Iain, that it wasn't in every hospital in the country, and that I had to campaign to get that rolled out across the whole of NHS England? And that's not even yet in the devolved nations. So there's more to be done in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So much more to do.
Well, we are going to have to stop that. It's a shame because I've literally got hundreds of texts and WhatsApp messages coming in. I can't get to them all. I apologise. I'm going to try and read through some of them over the next hour when somebody else is speaking, but really appreciate the effort that everyone has made. Theo, thank you for coming in. Theo's book is called Breaking Breaking the Taboo, Why We Need to Talk About Birth Trauma. It's published by my old company, Biteback, at £20 in hardback. Well worth £20 of your investment, I would say. Theo, great. Thank you very much indeed. Well, coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk about Shabana Mahmood's idea, where she says that paedophiles will face mandatory chemical castration. She's considering overhauling long-standing medical laws requiring a person's consent to administer such a treatment. Killers, rapists and other dangerous criminals will also be released after serving only half of their sentence under the biggest shake-up in sentencing laws in 30 years. I wonder what you make of this chemical castration thing, because it's quite something to say that somebody would have to be forced to have it. I think there are plenty of paedophiles who voluntarily have it for obvious reasons. But really? Mandatory? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Israel's Prime Minister claims Sir Keir Starmer has helped to embolden Hamas by calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu claims the British PM is on the wrong side of history after he signed a statement with French and Canadian leaders calling for an aid blockade to be lifted. Britain's already suspended talks on a possible trade deal with the Israelis. Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel's told LBC the Conservatives do not agree